episode of the Unfounded Podcast. I am your host, Christopher Turner, and I will be guiding you through this experience today, this next 35 or so minutes, if all goes as planned. I hope you are doing well out there. Hope you're staying at least somewhat entertained and sane in the craziness that is post-coronavirus United States of America. But like I said, I'm doing pretty good, actually. I'm starting to settle into this a little bit. I don't know if you guys are, but I'm getting a little used to seeing the streets emptier and seeing people out walking their dogs like every second of every day and all that kind of stuff. You know what I mean? It is kind of weird. It's going to be weird when we go back to normal to see like traffic again. Like all of the, you know the negative aspects of our society that kind of were helped by the coronavirus for temporarily, like traffic, for instance. It's been nice to see that go away. I'm kind of not looking forward to there being traffic and commutes and stuff like that again. But anyway, this world it's a weird one, that's for sure. Anyway, we talked enough about the coronavirus, I think, up until this point, right? So I'm going to go ahead and try to switch gears a little bit and go into a talk about perspective. Now, I know I've talked about perspective before, but I want to kind of look it up, do a definition, that kind of stuff like we usually do, just to see what we can come up with in a more focused talk on the subject, right? So perspective. It's the art of drawing solid objects on a two-dimensional surface so as to give the right impression of their height, width, depth, and position in relation to each other when viewed from a particular point, a perspective drawing. The second definition is a particular attitude toward a way of regarding something, a point of view. Most guidebook history is written from the editor's perspective, as an example. Okay, so these are both really helpful definitions, I think, because... And this is kind of cool because next to the definition, there's an image here. I'm going to open it up here. There's an image of like artist renderings of architectural drawings. And anyway, we'll come back to that. I just like these pictures. Anyway, perspective. So I like both these definitions. Point, I see come up in both. The word point, right, come up in both definitions. So there's some kind of similarity there. That's maybe distilling it down into the base. Perspective. In order to have a perspective, you have to view something from a certain point. Right, is what both of those definitions are getting to. That perspective is granted when you place yourself in a point, a specific position in time and space. You're then granted a perspective. Or you have a unique perspective. Because the only thing you have to do to change that perspective is to change the point. You see? You move the point where you're viewing it from and you change the perspective. Right? Pretty simple, right? But you see this being applied both in kind of the more, what would the word be? Practical implementation, kind of in drawing objects, architecture, that kind of stuff. And then the more... I guess more artistic, right? And then the second definition is more practical, right? But in the way you interact with people and the way you view people, that kind of stuff. Now, the reason I bring it up is because I think, along with the ego, an outsized ego tends to lend more credit to that individual perspective than is necessary. Not necessary, but is what's the word I'm trying to think of here? Sorry, guys. I'm I guess a little slow to start this morning. Perspective. Man, I just brain farted too. I just lost my complete train of thought there. Sorry, I am starting off really slow here. Not perspective, but the only thing you have to do is change a point, right? And an outsized ego. There we go. Okay, there we go. As your ego grows out of control, the view that you have of the value of your perspective grows out of control as well, right? So as you place yourself more in the ego, as you let that ego run things, you're going to start to feel like your way of viewing the world is the right way of viewing the world. And you can probably ask yourself this question right now. I'm sure you've already experienced this feeling inside of yourself at some point, especially if you focus on the political arena. You're going to definitely notice this popping out, right? This idea that, the opposition or the people that you would consider your political enemy just don't understand what I'm talking about because they don't they haven't gleaned enough information. They're ignorant, essentially, right? They don't see it from my perspective because my perspective is obviously the right one, right? Which is kind of the perspective. That's the way we approach these political issues, at least. And so it's a little more obvious to illustrate what I'm talking about here. The ego's role in your perspective. Now, I think we can probably get down to like more of the role of the ego a little later, but so often in life, I think so many of the conflicts we have, interpersonal conflicts, come from an inability to interpret the same information in the same way. It's a product of our perspective, which in turn kind of makes it a product of your ego as well, right? Kind of tangentially. But let's focus on just the former. So often I see people talking past each other, especially in the media, and the entertainment shows that you see on the news. Sorry for the computer noises. Especially on CNN and Fox News and MSNBC, all of the major news outlets. If you go watch, it's funny. I think what happens in those news channels is what you have is people that their expressed job is to find people with opposite perspectives that have difficulty inherently viewing the opposition's perspective, right? So people that are already so set in their perspective that they're not going to change it either way, they put two of those people in the same room and just let them go at each other, right? Unfortunately, it's not that hard to find people like that. Nextdoor. You know what? Here's a little tangent. Everybody's on this Nextdoor app, like telling people where the toilet paper is and stuff like that. I really appreciate the app. You know what I mean? But it's also kind of shows you just how power hungry so many people are. Like you have little like hierarchies developing in a Nextdoor app in a neighborhood, like people that like spend all their time watching who's walking around the neighborhood or picking up their dog poop or whatever, and they literally like use that app as a way to feel powerful. Anyway, I'm gonna leave that one there. Perspective difference, right? So often the perspectives that you see presented are not the people you see presented that defend perspectives defend them as if they are the only perspective to have, which is not true. There's actually unlimited perspectives you could take, hypothetically. If you were to think about all of the different ways you could view, let's say let's take just like a building, for instance. Let's take something like tangible. Take your house or something. How many different points in space and time could you stand and view that house from? Almost unlimited, right? Now, would any of those points that you're viewing that house from be more correct or true than any other? No, they're all pieces of the same thing, right? They're all pieces of that house. Different ways of viewing that house. Now, this is exactly the same thing that happens when you're talking about less tangible things like ideas, right? But it becomes more muddy because it's not, you can't walk around the house and say, oh yeah, it is still the same house, just different angle of viewing it. It's more muddy when you talk about ideas. And so I think what happens is people start to take or feel more justified in viewing their perspective as a panacea. Not only as a panacea, but the right one, right? We set up this value. We also set up the world as if it's something that can be viewed correctly. You hear people do this all the time. Like I said on the news too. You're just not viewing things right, or your perspective's off, or they're raised wrong, or whatever it is, right? And that assumes that there's a right way of viewing the world. And I don't know how you could ever how you could ever distill a right and wrong way of viewing the world, a right perspective. There's something illogical in it as well. Like, let's say let's say there was one right perspective, one right way to view the world. Well, because perspective requires like a point in time, you have to be placed in a point in time to view something. Like you automatically eliminate everyone from having that perspective because they'd have to be all standing at the same point in time at the same time. You know what I mean? You get what I'm saying, right? I know it's a little out there, but it's impossible for everybody to share the same perspective because it's also intrinsically tied to time and space. Perspective is tied to time and space. At least as it relates to the ego. Let's go back to the ego. I like talking about the ego, if you couldn't tell. Definitely going to be just kind of playing with ideas today, guys. I know the last couple episodes, like I said before, I don't like to get preachy, and I feel like in the last couple episodes I've gotten a little preachy. I didn't mean to, you know what I mean? Like, I really am not trying to make like a self-help book here, you know what I mean? Like, I'm trying to just play with ideas, and sometimes when I get on a certain idea that I think is correct, I'll kind of like preach it as if it's something that people need to implement in their lives, and I would like you to implement in your life, but I'm also not trying to do that with this podcast. Like, that's not the purpose of it, is to fix other people. The purpose of it is to fix myself. You know what I mean? And I would hope that if you're listening to this podcast, that's how you're treating it as well. Not as a means of like incorporating somebody else's perspective, but in a means of like finding your own, right? That's why I'm talking about perspective today. Who knows, right? I was actually listening to, I try to watch a lot of variety of media sources. You know, I watch the traditional news, not as much as I used to. I used to be addicted to like CNN and MSNBC and all those. Like I'd watch it all day for like 2 or 3 years. Like I was up to date on every single thing, politically at least, right? I don't really do that anymore. What I try to do now more so than anything else is to try to get a variety of perspectives through a variety of different sources. And the sources that I'm starting to rely on more so than others are, let's say, the smaller perspectives, the perspectives that are now made more popular. They're not even small anymore. They're the YouTube perspectives, right? These different like alternative new media sources, podcasts, you know what I mean? Engaging with those different sources gives you a much broader. It gives you a broader selection of information to incorporate into your image or your perspective of the world and current events, right? And it's more accurate because of that too. It's never going to be perfect, like I said. It's never going to be the right perspective, but it'll be more accurate if you use the most amount, if you bring in the most variety of data possible, right? But one thing I find interesting is even in the new media sources. So, for instance, one of the people that I watch for the more conservative perspective is Steven Crowder. I watched his, the Crowder thing on YouTube or whatever it is. And, there's some things that I really agree with Steven on. Like there's some things that I'm like, hell yeah, man, preach. And then there's some other times that I get not. Oh, I almost said offended. Oh my God. I don't. I don't get offended. I mean, like I get angry at him, and it's because. He's an example. Even the smaller organizations have this same problem going on. It's not just within CNN and MSNBC, Fox News, and all these where they have this kind of like perspective problem where there's one perspective that dominates, and then that's what gets pushed as a news story. What's happening? It's not just a product of big organizations; it's a product of people, and ego itself. And the reason I bring up Steven Crowder is like, even though I think the man's brilliant, I've never seen anybody with a bigger ego than that guy, ever. Even including like Trump. Steven Crowder has a big, massive ego problem that I think he needs to check if he wants to move. I'm not going to actually. That's not right. I shouldn't tell somebody what they need to do. I'm going to take that back, if you allow me. But I would say that I believe that man has an ego problem, and I don't think it lends his show credibility. What lends a show credibility is when they have an ability to describe and interact with the opposite perspectives. I don't know if you've ever seen it happen on TV, but if you've ever seen this happen in like regular life where people are just having an argument, let's say, and somebody says something that the other person can't refute, and they actually accept it, instead of just saying, blah, 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 I'm done. No. Or attacking or going on the defensive or whatever. Somebody brings up a point that they can't refute, and somebody actually says, you know what, I'm going to incorporate that because I can't figure out a better way to describe what you just said. I'm going to incorporate it into my perspective. And if there's something there that clashes against that, I'm gonna move it around. I'm gonna maybe start analyzing that piece of my perspective and see how accurate it is. You know what I mean? How often do you see that happen? I could probably count on my hands how many times I've seen people do that throughout my life. No kidding. I'm sure you're probably saying something similar. It's a profound problem. Because it's a problem you can never show other people. You can never show everyone, or one person, every perspective. Which is the only way that you could get an accurate conceptualization of what the world is and what the most correct perspective is a conglomerate of all of everybody's. You know what I mean? We haven't talked about spiritual stuff as much. One of the things that I find interesting was it was Alan Watts. Alan Watts talks about this, and I think I've brought this up before, but I love this description of what we are. Because it kind of lines nicely with perspective, I think. The way that one of the ways that Alan Watts described the universe and human beings, life itself. The way that he described life itself was as the universe trying to look at itself. Like, chew on that for a second. You know, that the reason that there are these beings that have all these just almost limitless amounts of beings running around on the earth, at least, with all varied perspectives. Even like animals have different perspectives, right? They're a different thing than we are. All of these varied perspectives. What is that? Why is that a thing? And then the best way that Alan Watts described it that I've heard is it's the universe looking at itself. You are a point through which the universe looks at itself and engages with itself. And that each individual person, each individual life form is in some sense an eye into the world. But part of what Alan, I think, at least my understanding of what he talks about, is that we are all the same thing. That universe. That is us. That is you. That is the cat down the street. You know? You are the universe looking at itself. You are you looking at you. And so is everybody else. Which is why I've said before that you aren't any different. You're not something else. You're not other than other people, you know. You're not other than the world itself. You come out of the world. I think the reason I'm bringing up perspective today is I, in my life, have encountered many times where I have failed to recognize this fact, that my perspective is fallible, and that I often view things in a zero-sum way, almost like in a right or not, right? And it's not only harmful to your ability to operate in the world if you go through life, you know, thinking that you're the only perspective that matters. It's not only harmful to you, but it's harmful to the world as well, because partially what moves us forward is our ability to engage with other perspectives. It's a conglomerate of those perspectives working together, taking in the most amount of data possible to try to come up with the best solution, you know, because no one person is enough, right? We've said that before too. No one person's enough. You're not enough by yourself. The most telltale sign of an evil person is them thinking they are. You know? You tell yourself you're enough to fix the world. You're maniacal. You're going to hurt a lot of people. You know what I mean? Now, one of the things that I've seen, I see a lot of positive and a lot of negative coming out of the coronavirus times, because, you know, I see a lot of people wanting to help, right? businesses and things like that. So one of the frustrating things we haven't talked about, and Crowder brought this up in one of his episodes, that why isn't the media talking about all of the small businesses and big businesses that are helping, banding together to produce the services and the goods that we need during a time of crisis. It's kind of similar to what happened in World War II when all these, GM and all these other companies, switched up their manufacturing lines to make, bombers and tanks and those kind of things. Similar to that, not as extreme, right? But I do find it problematic that we're not, focusing on that a little more. At least touting that as a positive of our economic system. Not only of our economic system, but a positive product of capitalism itself. That there are certain times where economic benefit and moral necessity align. And when that happens, capitalism is a pretty beautiful thing. You know what I mean? But it doesn't happen all the time, right? Almost never, actually. Anyway, but yeah, anyway, we can get down. We've already gotten down that rabbit hole before, I think. But I do think that we should be focusing a little bit more on the positive aspects of that, the ability of this economic system that we have produced to pull us through hard times, to sustain us when the world starts to crumble a little bit, And I do think that we need to maybe watch that a little closer and be a little less critical of things during this time, more so like watching what happened, what works and what doesn't, and trying to adjust our world after the fact based on that, so that when this happens again, whenever it does, because it will, maybe not now, maybe not for another 100 years, who knows, but when it does happen again, I don't know, I guess I was going to say are more prepared, but again, it's not like we were that unprepared this time, I don't think. That's one of the things I've been noticing, and I'm sure you're starting to notice it too, but I don't think this thing, I want to qualify this, because I know there's a lot of people that have lost people already to this disease. I'm not trying to say that the disease or the virus isn't bad. I know people that are very sick from this, and I'm, just like everybody else, scared that those people, could get sicker. At the same time, I do not like the way we reacted to this. It brought up all... It's kind of like during a time of crisis, you expect people to kind of... some of the political games and stuff to kind of slow down. You know what I mean? That's what you'd expect. A banding together. That's one of the things that kind of... I remember about 9/11 that I don't remember as much. I don't see happening right now as much. Maybe a little bit. There is this kind of political easing that happened after 9/11 because we had a shared enemy again, right? Like up until that point, we had no major wars going on. I think we had Bosnia, things like that, but it was smaller engagements, right? And I think because of that, the American people didn't have to worry about, outside forces. And so when people don't have to worry about outside forces, they find inside forces to worry about, enemies within. Right, and you start worrying more about the enemy within than the enemy without, right? Until something happens that reminds you that there's enemies without. And so, by giving you another thing to focus on, it bands everybody together, right? It's an outside threat thing, right? You'd expect a similar kind of thing to happen when you have like a global pandemic, even more so because it's a human problem. It's not even like... It's like the thing that should supersede tribalism. It's like the thing that should overcome our tribal instinct is when there is an outside threat that's bigger than any single human or country or society or anything like that. It's literally an existential threat. That should band us together. What you see happening instead is I think virtue signaling. At least politically, what you see is both parties scrambling to make the right decisions so that they can finally be vindicated as the right side. The madness within the political game that goes on in the United States is if you exist within it for longer than 30 seconds, it makes you want to vomit. Because it's so illogical. I've literally seen news stations come out with one story saying one thing about the virus, and then literally a day later saying the exact opposite thing about the virus. On and on and on and on. I'm sure you've seen this happen too. And I think in one thing I'm maybe tying a bunch of different issues together here. We have a political problem in the United States. Obviously, it's tribal. At a basic level, it's a tribal problem. We have another big problem though, and it's a dying media conglomerate, a dying media industry that in its death throes is throwing out propaganda left and right to try to win back viewership. And it's making a world in which it is impossible to glean glean real insight, because the information you're being given a lot of times is intentionally false, I think. Not because there's a desire to spread misinformation. It's a desire to win people over to a side. It's a tribal problem, like I said. And so it's devolved so much so that even during a global pandemic, we are only playing those games. Politically, right? We're still playing those games. It's one of the reasons. Why do you think there was such a quick reaction, initially to there's this. It's so funny to watch. And I'm just going to use this as an example because it's been the most obvious for me. Again, I'm not trying to take sides on this, but to watch kind of the reaction that's come out of the media, in the last 2 months, because initially it was kind of when Trump first did the China ban. I don't know if you remember that, when he banned travel from China in January or something like that. Every news organization called it racist and was calling him racist for banning travel from China and all that kind of stuff, saying it was over the top, that you're just doing this because you want to keep people from coming in the United States. He doesn't like Asian people or something like that, right? Well, then a month later, you literally have every major Democratic state announcing a lockdown, right? What happened? Were you playing a political game before or after? Right? Because one of those doesn't add up. And I think that's what's partially happening right now, is there's so much flip-flopping going on by the media organizations that it's actually in a weird way showing you how unfounded the political parties' ideals are, period. That the parties themselves aren't based on ideals anymore. They were at one point, but they're not anymore. What they've become is effectively, they're war parties. Built for the express purpose of eliminating the opposite party. It's the only thing that they do well anymore. And they actually don't even do that well. Most of their actions serve to only propagate the opposite perspective more. You know what I mean? So we're in this weird time where the death throes of one industry, I think, is illustrating the problems within another. And I say industry isn't the right way to describe our political system, right? But the death throes of one system is identifying or showing the problems intrinsic within another. Because I'm telling you right now, folks, if we don't fix whatever's going on politically in this country, it doesn't matter if it's a coronavirus or what. We won't be able to stand forever. We got to figure this problem out. This political problem is not getting better. Got to figure it out. Because there's way too many bad actors in the world. As from the way it looks right now, China looks like a really, really bad actor right now. One that may have essentially killed thousands of people because of their inaction and their intentional withholding of information from people and straight up lying. There's been reports coming out of China that they have been doing some really wicked shit to people. Like people that are whistleblowers and stuff disappearing, that kind of stuff, right? You haven't heard anything out of Russia in like 3 months, right? You haven't heard nothing, not a peep. You have no idea how they're doing, right? That scares the living shit out of me. Because those two countries right there, China and Russia, they have a shared interest. I think their shared interest is in seeing their shared competition go away. I often wonder if the coronavirus could have been, right, intentionally released, precisely to precipitate an economic collapse. I talked about this in the last episode. I do worry that there is political aspirations behind what is going on right now. And that while we are sitting here fighting amongst ourselves, watching our media conglomerates die, we have two countries out there that do not have to operate under the same moral imperative. Because their systems don't require it. If those two countries ever look at us, or view this for what it is, a weak point, we're in some serious trouble. Anyway, that's probably a long ways off. I'm just saying I don't like that this perspective problem is actually tearing us apart as a country internally. And even though, yes, people have kind of, the system paused, and people are kind of getting friendly and becoming human again for the 2 months that the system paused, but you turn that machine back on and people are going to go right back to the same thing if you don't fix the machine. That was the problem. Do you know what I mean? And if the machine, it's the people that are the problem. It's not the machine. You know what I mean? You got to fix the people. You got to fix the egos. You got to fix the perspectives running around. The ego problems running around here. Right? How much time am I in? I've talked for a long time. I feel like. Maybe not. What do we got here? Dang! 32 and a half minutes. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this talk up until this point. I did. I just wanted to play with the idea of perspective a little more. Hopefully we got something useful out of it. But I really hope that through this time, as we move forward, it looks like we're in the worst week of it right now, the peak week of this coronavirus pandemic. It should, at least in the United States, it should be starting to come down the next couple of weeks, and hopefully we all get back to some slice of normal, right? But with that, I think as we return to some slice of normal, we need to kind of take with it like everything that caused this panic, everything that caused, and everything that happened after the fact. All the good, all the negative, and try to incorporate more of the good and leave behind some of the negative. Let some of that deadwood burn off. The deadwood within our society. This tribalism that exists within the political system itself is a product of tribalism that exists within the human condition itself. Is the ego a survival instinct? Like, if you take the premise I've been presenting all of these episodes, right? That you are not your ego. That you're something deeper, something more long-lasting. Then accepting, all the other scientific theories that have come before, evolution itself, how would something like the ego evolve? Because it's obviously a real thing. How would that evolve? Why would it evolve? Obviously for some purpose. It's obviously beneficial to survival in some way. Is the ego the outward manifestation of the unbridled survival instinct? The outward and inward manifestation of the unbridled survival instinct. The thing that tells you to move, the thing that tells you keep going. The rat race itself, I think, preys on the survival instinct. You can't stop, you'll die, right? Don't stop, you'll die. Well, what happened over the last 2 months? It stopped. That's why I think people are so freaked out, and it's also why I don't think this is going to go back to normal so quickly. In order for the machine to work, it requires that people keep moving. It requires people to think that their survival is intrinsically tied to work. But if all of this stops for 2 months, even though people know that they're probably going to have to go back to work at some point, it shows you that if everything stops, you're still here. Whoa. It shows you that the things that you think you've come to need, you don't need. That there's very, very, very little in the world that you actually need. What do you need? There are some basic things nobody can deny. One of those being food. One of those being water. And I think one of those being another perspective. I don't think you can survive without another perspective to bounce yours off of, like we've talked about. And that, in a really beautiful way, the machine stopping for 2 months has showed us, has brought us closer to our true needs. Left to your own devices with nothing else to control and seize your time, what do? You go walk with people. You go talk to people. You go play with their perspective a little bit. Let's hold on to that when this machine turns back on. All right? And with that, I'm going to leave it there, guys. That's the Unfounded Podcast signing off. I hope you enjoyed everything, and I will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.